If you've ever seen Nero Wolfe angry before breakfast, you know what a crime that is. The man doesn't merely dislike interruptions to his schedule. He considers them a personal affront to civilization. So when the doorbell rang at 7:43 a.m., a full 17 minutes before Fritz was due to set down his poached eggs, I knew this wasn't going to be a good day. I opened the door with the kind of enthusiasm I usually reserve for tax forms and blind dates. Arranged by lonely ants, the man standing on the stoop looked like a failed magician. Black overcoat too long, a soft-brimmed fedora slightly askew, and a white goatee that curled like smoke-off. A bad idea. He smelled faintly of lilacs and mothballs. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked, glancing behind me as if expecting a piano to drop. "That's me." "You the guy delivering the morning doom?" He blinked. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately." Everyone needs to see Mr. Wolfe. Most don't. Some live longer that way. He reached into his coat, not fast enough to alarm me, but deliberate enough to make my right hand twitch toward my pocket. He withdrew an envelope, sealed in wax, with an elaborate crest that looked like it belonged to a villain in a Gothic novel. "It's a matter of life and death," he said. "I've heard that phrase a lot. Usually it's neither." I took the envelope. "Your name?" "Sherlock Holmes," he said, straight-faced. I let a bead hang there. "Sure, and I'm Dr. Watson? You want to try again with something that doesn't come out of a fan fiction forum?" He exhaled. "My given name is Holmes. My father fancied himself literary. My surname is DeWitt, Sherlock Holmes DeWitt. I usually go by Mr. DeWitt. Smart." I left him in the hall and climbed the stairs to Wolfe's room. Fritz passed me carrying a tray with a silver pot of coffee, looking like a man delivering communion to a very judgmental god. I knocked. Wolfe's growl came through the wood. "What is it, Archie?" "You've got a visitor. Says his name is Sherlock Holmes. Claims he's got a death in the family, maybe his own." "I have not finished my breakfast." I warned him you don't work before eggs. He said it was urgent. Wolfe cursed softly in Serbian, probably something to do with incompetent mankind, and told me to show him in after 10 minutes. I went back downstairs and told DeWitt to warm the bench. When the time came, I led him through the front room, past Wolfe's mountainous globe, and into the office with its familiar scent of beer, leather, and the faint ghost of orchids. Wolfe was in his chair, vast and immovable, like a granite Buddha with better tailoring. He didn't stand. He never does. DeWitt stepped inside, stopped, and stared not at Wolfe, but at the portrait above the desk. "Is that your father?" "No," Wolfe rumbled. "That is not why you're here. Sit down." "Speak." DeWitt did both, adjusting his coat like it had secrets. He placed the envelope on the desk but didn't open it. "My uncle, Victor Ames, died 3 nights ago. He was a collector of rare literature and Victorian oddities." "A fool, then," Wolfe cut in. "I won't argue. But he was also precise. Obsessive. He kept his records as neatly as any clerk in a bank vault. And yet, yes?" Wolfe said he was buried yesterday morning, only... DeWitt leaned in and his voice dropped. "There's no headstone. No name, no record. The cemetery claims he was never interred." Wolfe's eyes didn't blink, but I saw his fingers twitch once on the armrest. "And where?" Wolfe said softly. "Is this cemetery?" DeWitt exhaled like a man taking off a mask. "A private plot in Westchester, known among collectors and mystery aficionados as the Cemetery with No Names. It's a secluded graveyard that caters to clients who want discretion. Criminals, eccentrics, and the untraceable," I muttered. "Sounds like a dating pool." Wolfe ignored me. "And what does this have to do with your uncle?" DeWitt slid the envelope forward. "Wolfe didn't touch it, I believe. My uncle's death was a murder, covered up by someone with access to the cemetery. The head caretaker vanished the same day. And someone has since tried to purchase my uncle's entire collection of manuscripts, quietly, anonymously." "That's no coincidence." "No," Wolfe said, voice dry. "But it is inconvenient." I waited. Wolfe stared at the envelope like it owed him money. Then, at last, he sighed. "Very well, Mr. DeWitt. Leave the envelope. Mr. Goodwin will visit." "This cemetery I will not—" "No surprise there," I said. But if this place really is a who's who of the weird and rich, I'll need a tie that repels ghosts. Wolfe frowned. We're the gray one. And just like that, we had a mystery. A dead man with no grave, a cemetery with no names, and a visitor named Sherlock Holmes. Just another day at the brownstone. I don't scare easy, but I do believe in reading the fine print before you wander into a place called the cemetery with no names. It doesn't exactly scream welcoming. By the time I got to Westchester, the sky had decided to dress the whole scene with a low fog, thick enough to make a man wonder if he'd shaved that morning. My cab driver was chatty until I told him where I was going, and then he clammed up. Like I'd just asked for directions to Dracula's summer home. The cemetery gate was iron, old enough to have rust, but new enough to swing open without screaming. There was no sign, no office, not even one of those helpful little maps with a cartoon ghost saying you are here. The place looked like somebody's idea of a bad poem. Uneven stones, moss creeping over marble angels, and rows of graves with nothing but numbers or blank slates. If there were names, they were hidden under years of neglect and secrecy. I walked in, hands in my coat pockets, trying not to whistle because the fog was already making enough noise, according to DeWitt. Victor Ames's funeral had been 2 mornings ago, so I figured the ground where he'd been planted would still look fresh. That was the plan anyway. I started down the crooked path, counting the rows, reading what I could. Some stones just had years, 1913 to 1947. Others just said things like beloved son or in memory. One had nothing at all, just a slab of black granite, smooth as a lie, halfway through the western side. I found a patch of dirt that looked like it had been turned recently. The grass was dark and clumpy, and the 2 nearest stones had mud splattered on them, as if someone hadn't bothered with a tarp. I knelt and ran a finger through the soil, still damp. Still soft. Then came the sound of a cough behind me. I stood and turned to find a man who could have doubled for a gargoyle thin. Gray skin, a nose like a hawk's beak, and eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Who authorized you to be here? He asked. I gave him my best Troy boy smile. The gate was open, so I assumed the ghost put out the welcome mat. You assumed wrong. Story of my life. I stepped closer, keeping my tone light, but noting that his hands were shaking not with fear, but with some kind of barely leashed irritation. I'm looking for the grave of Victor Ames, I said. You the caretaker? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he squinted at me like I was a math problem. The caretaker, he finally muttered, is unavailable. I look after the grounds now. Good for you. Then you can tell me why Mr. Ames doesn't seem to have a name on his grave or a record in the cemetery's files. That earned me a thin, humorless smile. Some who come here prefer anonymity. Yeah, but most of them also prefer staying dead. So if you don't mind, he held up a hand. Enough questions. You're not supposed to be here. Before I could argue, I caught sight of a figure standing farther down the path. Partially hidden by fog. It was a woman tall, draped in a dark veil that fluttered faintly in the breeze. She was standing perfectly still, one gloved hand resting on a gravestone, watching me. When I turned back to Mr. Gargoyle, he was already walking away, his shoulders hunched. Muttering to himself, I glanced at the woman again, but she was gone. The only thing left was the faint smell of lilacs, just like DeWitt's coat. I made a mental note and decided I'd seen enough strange for one morning. On my way out, I spotted a freshly broken branch near the fence, about 100 feet from the gate. Someone had climbed over in a hurry. A few strands of dark fabric still clung to the jagged wood. By the time I got back to the cab, the fog had thickened, and the driver didn't bother asking questions when I told him to step on it. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the plant room, glaring at an orchid like it owed him money. He didn't look up when I came in. Well? He said. Well, I replied, dropping my coat on the chair. You were right. It's a perfectly ghastly place. One fresh grave, no name, one creepy groundskeeper, one mysterious lady, and one broken fence that suggests someone was sneaking around after dark. Wolfe snorted softly. Of course. All cemeteries are repositories of secrets. Some simply lack the courtesy to label them. Speaking of secrets, I said, the woman who vanished into the fog? She was wearing a veil, and she left behind the scent of lilacs. That got him. His eyes finally shifted away from the orchid, and for the first time since morning, Wolfe looked interested. Lilacs, he murmured. Same as DeWitt, I said. He straightened slightly in his chair, his expression sharpening the way it always does when he's just connected 2 points the rest of us didn't even know were on the map. Archie, he said, find out everything you can about Mr. DeWitt's family, particularly the women, and send word to Inspector Kramer. He'll no doubt blunder into this soon enough. We may as well save him the embarrassment of tripping over our evidence. I grinned, gladly. Nothing warms me up on a cold day like a little quality time with the NYPD. Wolfe didn't smile, but his fingers drummed once on the arm of his chair. Something about the way he stared at the orchids told me this case wasn't going to stay neatly potted. If you ever want to appreciate how delicate family politics can get, try walking into somebody's living room and telling them you're investigating a murder that hasn't happened yet. By the time I tracked down Devitt's brownstone on the Upper East Side, it was early evening, and the street lamps were already doing battle with a stubborn twilight. The house was the kind that tries hard to impress you. Polished brass knocker, white stone steps scrubbed clean, curtains drawn just enough to let you guess somebody was watching you approach. I rang the bell and heard footsteps. The door opened. On a young man in his late 20s, all angles and nerves, wearing a sweater vest that might have looked better if it didn't look borrowed from his grandfather. Yes? He asked, glancing me over like he was expecting a process server. Archie Goodwin, I said, flashing him my card. I'm here to speak with anyone in the DeWitt family who can tell me why one of their relatives keeps getting scented notes and threats involving a cemetery. The kid hesitated. You're with the police? Not exactly, I said. Better, I work for Nero Wolfe. That did the trick. His eyebrows went up, but he stepped aside and let me in without another. Word. The place was tastefully furnished, all dark wood and bookshelves. A faint smell of lilacs lingered in the air, not strong, but sharp enough to notice. I was shown into a sitting room where 3 people were already waiting, a woman in her late 40s with impeccable posture and an even more impeccable silk dress, perched on the edge of the sofa like she owned both it and everyone who ever sat on it. An older man with a cane, not Holmes, but someone with the same faintly hunted look, seated by the fireplace, staring into the flames as though they were the only thing keeping him sane. And the young man who'd opened the door, who hovered behind a chair like he was hoping it would shield him from whatever was coming. Mr. Goodwin, the woman said. Her voice was cool and precise like a scalpel. You're here on behalf of Mr. Wolfe? That's right, I said. And you're Claire DeWitt, she said. Victor Ames was my cousin. And the man who calls himself Sherlock? Holmes is my brother. Well, that explains some things. She gestured toward the older man by the fire. My uncle Matthew. And you've already met my son, Henry. Charmed, I said, though nobody seemed particularly charmed back. I won't waste your time, Claire continued. We've all received notes, as you evidently already know. But my brother insisted on hiring Mr. Wolfe rather than letting the police make a spectacle of the family. Perhaps you can tell us what he hopes to achieve? I stayed standing, letting them all watch me pace a few steps toward the fireplace. Mr. Wolfe, I said, intends to figure out who thinks it's clever to send death threats to your family and dump bodies in a cemetery nobody wants to admit exists. So far we know about Victor Ames. We also know about the woman who wears lilac perfume and enjoys disappearing into fog. Perhaps one of you can tell me which of your kin likes to play ghost? That got me a reaction, but not the one I expected. Uncle Matthew's head snapped up, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was rough, but sharp enough to cut through the polite tension. You saw her? He demanded. I might have, I said. Care to clarify who she is? He leaned forward, gripping his cane like it was the only thing holding him together. My late wife, he said hoarsely. Eleanor, dead these 10 years, buried in that same damn cemetery. And if you tell me you saw her, Claire cut in. Crisply. Uncle, enough, but Matthew wasn't listening anymore. He stared at me like I'd just yanked a ghost out of his closet. she warned me, he muttered. Told me I'd be next. Said the cemetery wasn't finished with me yet. Henry shifted uncomfortably behind the chair. Claire stood and took her uncle's arm, steadying him. I think, she said coolly, you've gotten what you came for, Mr. Goodwin. You can tell Mr. Wolfe that we expect results, quickly. I let them think they'd gotten the last word. But as I stepped back out into the humid evening air, my mind was already turning over the pieces, a family with too many secrets, a cemetery that collected the dead without names, a woman who smelled like lilacs and walked through fog like it belonged to her. And now, apparently, a dead wife who sent warnings from beyond the grave. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was still in his chair, one hand cradling a beer and the other absent-mindedly turning a page of his book. He glanced up when I walked in. Well? They're lying, I said, all of them, about something. Maybe everything. Wolfe's lips curved, just slightly. Of course they are, he said. They are a family. That is what families do. Then he drained his beer, set it down, and reached for the bell to summon Fritz. Tomorrow, he said, we invite Mr. Kramer to join us. He is due a blunder. There are two kinds of people you meet on this job. The kind who tell you nothing and think they're being clever, and the kind who tell you everything and think you're an idiot. The DeWitts? They were shaping up to be both. Wolfe, of course, refused to leave his chair or his orchids, which meant I was back on the street at 9 sharp the next morning, fortified by coffee and curiosity to figure out what skeletons were hiding in the family closet and which ones were already walking around in fog. First stop was the cemetery with no names. Again, you might ask why. I'd start my day in a graveyard with bad landscaping and worse vibes, but Wolfe likes patterns. And my hunch was whatever mess we were cleaning up started right here. I got there before the fog had burned off completely. The air was cool and wet, and the ground still carried the smell of earth freshly turned. I wasn't alone this time. There was a man kneeling in front of one of the stones, not Victor Ames's grave, but one a few rows over, scrubbing the stone with what looked like sandpaper and humming to himself. I strolled over and stopped a few feet behind him. Morning, I said. He froze mid-hum, then straightened up and turned around, blinking at me through wire-rimmed glasses. Oh, he said. Oh, didn't hear you come up. I get that a lot, I told him. Name's Goodwin, you? He wiped his hands on a rag. Trent, Stanley Trent, groundskeeper. I thought the guy yesterday was the groundskeeper. Oh, him, he's temporary. They call me when they need real work done. Stones don't clean themselves. I gave him my best winning smile. That's funny, because when I was here yesterday, he seemed pretty possessive of the place. Acted like he owned it, Stanley sniffed. He doesn't own squat. Nobody owns this place, least of all him. Well then, I said, maybe you can help me with something. I'm looking for any records, plot maps, guest lists, whatever, that can tell me who's buried here, including a Victor Ames. Stanley snorted. Good luck with that. This place doesn't keep records. People who get buried here, they don't want to be found. I didn't like the sound of that, but before I could push further, a movement caught my eye across the cemetery. Near the fence where I'd seen the broken branch yesterday, the figure of a woman, same dark veil, same measured steps, appeared. Again, standing perfectly still, I started toward her, but by the time I rounded the nearest headstone, she was gone again, leaving only the faint trace of lilacs behind. I pocketed a loose scrap of black fabric snagged on the fence post, this time longer, with a jagged edge like it had torn in a hurry. Friend of yours? Stanley called from behind me. Something like that, I said, tucking the scrap away. Tell me, Stanley, you ever see her before? His lips twitched into something that might have been a smile or just gas. Plenty of ghosts in this place, Mr. Goodwin. Some of, don't stay where they're put. I left him to his stones and his humming. Next stop was the Midtown offices of DeWitt and Ames. Attorneys at law, the family's pride and joy, and, according to my notes, the place where Victor Ames worked before he became the cemetery's latest resident. The receptionist gave me a look that suggested she thought I was there to deliver bad news or bad habits. But she pointed me toward an associate named Peterson, who wore the kind of suit that makes a man look respectable even when he isn't, Peterson claimed to know. Nothing. Always a good sign. Victor was troubled, Peterson said, adjusting his tie. There were rumors about debts, and a woman, but nothing concrete. A woman who wore lilac, maybe? I asked. That earned me a blink and a polite little cough. I couldn't say. He couldn't say a lot of things, but his eyes darted to a framed photograph on his desk when I brought up the cemetery. It was a photo of a company picnic. A dozen or so people smiling stiffly under a tent. And there, off to the side, was the veiled woman. I didn't mention it. No sense tipping my hand before I'd filled in the rest of the picture. Back outside, I called Wolfe and gave him the update while a hot dog vendor tried to sell me 2 for 1. She's not just haunting the cemetery, I told Wolfe. She's in their offices too, and at their family gatherings. The DeWitts are lying about knowing her, and Ames might have been the one paying for her silence, until he stopped paying. Wolfe made a thoughtful sound on the other end. You have the scrap of fabric? He asked. Right here, I said. And the caretaker? Stanley says the other guy's a fake? Claims nobody keeps records there and nobody wants to be found. Of course, Wolfe murmured. These people never learn. They bury secrets and expect the soil to be loyal. He hung up before I could ask what he meant. Which is Wolfe for? You're on the right track, Archie. Keep walking it, So that's what I did, and before the day was over, I'd picked up 3 more things. A name, Eleanor DeWitt. A bank statement that didn't belong to Victor Ames but showed monthly cash withdrawals in round sums. And a quiet warning from Inspector Kramer that he'd already arrested someone for Ames's murder, and he hoped to hell. I wasn't about to make him look stupid. That last one pretty much guaranteed I would, if you ever need proof that. The city runs on bad timing. Just try to wrap up a murder investigation before the corpse count doubles. By the time I got back to the brownstone that evening, the sun was down, the air smelled like rain, and I had enough facts and scraps of fabric to knit a sweater. Wolfe was in his office, reading a book with a title I couldn't pronounce, and drinking beer like it was medicine. I gave him the day's haul, the name Eleanor DeWitt, dead wife, very much alive in fog. The bank statement, anonymous withdrawals, to somebody's hush fund. And Kramer's warning about his shiny new arrest. He listened in silence, which for Wolfe is roughly equivalent to applause. When I finished, he set his glass down and spoke without looking up. The arrested party? Didn't say? Just that he was feeling smug? Then he has the wrong person, Wolfe declared flatly, turning a page. I sat. You sound sure? Of course I'm sure, he said. Kramer's habitual error. He pounces on a conspicuous fact and ignores its context. Who was arrested is irrelevant. What matters is who hasn't been arrested yet. That was classic Wolfe, and also maddening. Before I could press him, the phone rang. I got it on the second ring. It was Kramer. Goodwin, he barked. Tell your boss to stay the hell out of this one. I've got it wrapped. You always do, I said. Just out of curiosity, who's your lucky winner? Henry DeWitt? He snapped. We'd picked him up outside the cemetery an hour ago, trespassing, digging near one of the graves like a lunatic, found dirt all over him and a bloody rock in his pocket. Open and shut. Well, I'll be, I said cheerfully. Congratulations. When you're done pinning a medal on yourself, you might want to check behind you. Things have a habit of sneaking up when you're busy celebrating. Kramer growled something unprintable and hung up. I turned to Wolfe. Henry DeWitt, I said, caught red-handed with a rock, satisfied? Wolfe's lip curled. No. Didn't think so. That night I couldn't sleep. Something about the kid, Henry, didn't fit. He was nervous when I met him, sure, but not enough to bash someone's head in and bury them. And why would he go back to the cemetery? After the first round of threats? The next morning brought the answer, and another corpse. This time it wasn't in the cemetery. It was in the DeWitt's own brownstone. When I arrived, the place was crawling with uniforms. I flashed my license, ignored the dirty looks, and made my way inside. Claire DeWitt was seated stiffly on the couch, wrapped in a shawl. Uncle Matthew stood by the fireplace, looking older and grayer than before. The body lay near the study door, covered by a sheet. I didn't have to peek to know it was Stanley Trent, the cemetery's real caretaker, though. I caught a glimpse of his shoes sticking out. Kramer spotted me and barreled over like a bull that had just realized. The matador was still in the ring. "Goodwin," he barked. "Tell Wolfe to keep his fat nose out of this. We've already got Henry in custody. Trent was cleaning up for him. Case closed." "Sure," I said. "Just one thing. If Trent was cleaning up for Henry, why did Henry have to sneak back? To the cemetery at night? And why is Trent dead now instead of yesterday?" That earned me a scowl and a finger in my face. One word from Wolfe and I'll... Yeah, I cut in. "Save it for the papers." When I got back to the brownstone and laid it all out for Wolfe, he didn't look surprised. "2 deaths," he murmured. "One staged as a message, the other as a silencing. And Kramer remains convinced that young Henry is responsible." "You don't buy it?" I asked. He snorted. "Phewie, if Henry DeWitt had half the cunning required to orchestrate this, he would have already left the country. No, Archie, the true culprit is hiding behind a fiction. A fiction that, with a little effort, I can now dismantle." I raised an eyebrow. Wolfe's eyes glinted. "Call Inspector Kramer," he said. "And summon the entire DeWitt household here at 8 tonight," I grinned. "The big reveal?" I asked. Wolfe allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Yes," he said. "Tonight, Archie, we unmask the ghost. You'd think with 2 bodies, a weeping family, a veiled lady ghost, and a police inspector breathing fire, Nero Wolfe would be in his element, strutting his brain power and making the rest of us feel like pawns in his chess game. Instead, he decided he'd had enough. It started when Fritz came in at 5:30 with a note from Inspector Kramer. Wolfe read it in silence, frowned at it like it was a fly in his beer, then set it down and announced, "Archie, I am done." I leaned against my desk. "Done with what?" "This case," he said. "These people, this entire grotesque spectacle. I will not be made a party to it any longer." I stared. "Come again?" "I quit," Wolfe said simply. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and laced his fingers over his belly like a man who'd just signed a treaty. "Why?" I asked. He waved a hand. "The DeWitts are imbeciles. The police are obstinate. The entire affair is not worth the cost of my attention, let alone the risk of indigestion." I crossed the room and stood over him. "That's rich." "This morning you called it a fascinating fiction that you could dismantle with a little effort. Since when do you leave a fiction half-told?" He opened one eye just far enough to glare at me. "Archie, a man must know when to conserve his energies. They have made a mess of things. Let them wallow in it." "We are not saviors, that's poetic," I said. "But you already ordered me to summon the family here at 8. They're expecting your grand finale." "I rescind the invitation." He said coolly, "It was moments like this that made me appreciate just how stubborn Wolfe could be, and also how easily he could be manipulated if you knew the trick. So I said nothing. I just walked to my desk, sat down, and picked up the scrap of black fabric from my pocket. Without a word, I tossed it onto the corner of his desk. Right where it would sit in his line of sight. Sure enough, his eye flicked toward it. And stayed there. "I found that yesterday," I said. "On the cemetery fence. The same veil fabric as the lady who keeps floating around. Only this time it was torn and there was something inside it." Wolfe sat up an inch. "Inside it?" I nodded and picked up the scrap, shaking out a tiny, folded slip of paper that had been tucked into the seam. He held out his hand and I dropped it into his palm. He unfolded it slowly, his lips tightening as he read. It was just one line written in hurried pencil. "Meet me at the fence tonight after they're gone." I didn't need to tell him who he was. Wolfe stared at it for a long moment, then let out a deep sigh. "Confound them," he murmured. "Confound them all," I grinned. "So we're back on the case?" "Of course we are," he grumbled. "We have no choice now. This," he waved the note in disgust, "is sheer impudence. The woman thinks she can orchestrate murders and still arrange clandestine meetings under my nose. Phewie, I will not tolerate it." "That's more like it," I said. He scowled. "Very well," he said, shifting his bulk in the chair and ringing. "For Fritz, have Fritz prepare the office for our guests, and tell Kramer that if he wishes to avoid further embarrassment, he had better arrive promptly at 8. Yes, sir, I said, heading for the phone. Oh, and Archie, he called. After me, yeah? He sniffed and glanced at the orchids. Remind me to water these tonight. If I must endure these people in my house, at least my orchids need not suffer as well. There are moments in this business when you get the strange feeling that the pieces you've been sweating over are actually playing you by the time 8 o'clock rolled around. The brownstone was ready for its usual pageant. Chairs arranged like a jury box, Fritz stationed just out of sight in case refreshments or restraint were required, and Wolfe seated at his desk like a Roman emperor about to pass sentence. The DeWitts filed in on schedule, wearing expressions that ranged from righteous indignation to barely disguised panic. Claire was still crisp and cool in a dark green suit. Uncle Matthew leaned heavily on his cane and glowered at the floor. Henry shuffled. In behind them, eyes darting everywhere, but at Wolfe. Inspector Kramer stormed in last, clutching his hat like he wanted to strangle it. All right, Wolfe, Kramer barked. You've got them here. You've got me here. Now, what the hell is this about? Patience, Inspector, Wolfe rumbled. You shall have your answer. I stood in my usual spot by the bookshelves, keeping my eyes on the DeWitts while Wolfe began his usual overture, a few cutting remarks about the weather, the police department, and the general state of humanity until he finally got to the matter at hand. I have, he announced, all but identified the culprit responsible for the deaths of Victor Ames and Stanley Trent. A ripple of something, fear, maybe passed through the room. Then Wolfe dropped his hand on the desk with an audible thump. However, he continued, this afternoon brought me an unexpected document that complicates the narrative. It seems one among you was not content merely to kill. You sought to rewrite history itself. That earned him a few stares, Kramer grunted. What the devil are you talking about? Wolfe motioned to me. Archie. I reached into my pocket and produced the item in question, a thin, folded letter. This, I said, was slipped inside the ledger of cemetery accounts, hidden between 2 pages that hadn't been touched in years. I found it this afternoon, while pretending to wait for Kramer to arrest the wrong guy again. Kramer growled something that sounded like my name and wisecrack, mashed together. But I ignored him and handed the letter to Wolfe. Wolfe unfolded it, cleared his throat, and read aloud, Eleanor, stop this at once. I have paid you enough. To keep you quiet, do not think you can blackmail me again. If you persist, I will do what I should have done years ago. CD. When he finished, the room froze. Claire's eyes narrowed, but she didn't flinch. Henry stared at her, then at his uncle, then back again. Uncle Matthew's cane clattered to the floor. Wolfe let the silence linger, just long enough to become unbearable before adding, this letter was dated 2 weeks before the death of Victor Ames. It indicates that not only was Eleanor DeWitt alive and at large, but she had resumed a campaign of extortion against her family, specifically Claire DeWitt. Claire's mouth tightened into something that might have been a smile or a snarl. That letter, she said at last, proves nothing. A threat, perhaps, but it doesn't prove I killed her, or anyone else. On the contrary, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that low, iron tone he used when he was about to skewer someone. It proves motive. You have denied knowledge of Eleanor's presence, and yet here is your handwriting, unmistakable, betraying that knowledge along with your resentment of her demands. I had to give Claire credit. She didn't wilt. Yes, she said, steady as a metronome. I wrote that letter. And yes, Eleanor was blackmailing me. But I didn't kill her. Wolfe tilted his head. Then who did? Claire's eyes flicked, just for an instant, toward Uncle Matthew, and that, ladies and gentlemen, was all Wolfe needed. He leaned back, laced his fingers, and closed his eyes as if savoring the moment. You see, Archie, he murmured, the beauty of family secrets is that they are rarely kept by a single pair of hands, and inevitably one pair grows tired. It's something to watch when Wolfe finally finds his thread. You can almost see it in his eyes, like a cat who just noticed the canary moved. After Claire's glance toward Uncle Matthew, the whole room went quiet again. Henry looked at his mother like he didn't recognize her, while Matthew picked up his cane from the floor and stared into it, as though the answers were carved into the wood. Wolfe opened his eyes and fixed them squarely on Matthew. "You," he said softly, "knew Eleanor was alive long before this business began." Matthew's jaw tightened. "You tolerated her blackmail of your niece," Wolfe continued, "because it preserved the fiction you had created after her death. The fiction of a faithful husband mourning his late wife, when in fact you drove her away years ago, then buried her clothes in an empty casket to satisfy appearances." Matthew shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Wolfe leaned forward now, his voice a little sharper. "When she returned," he went on, "you hoped to keep her quiet by paying her, but she grew greedy. And then came Victor Ames. What did he threaten you with, I wonder? What did he see that night at the cemetery when Eleanor summoned him there?" For a moment nobody breathed. Then Matthew spoke, low and bitter. "He saw enough," he admitted. Wolfe nodded, as if he'd just been handed the final piece of a jigsaw. "You killed Ames," Wolfe said flatly. "And then you killed Stanley Trent, the caretaker, because he'd seen you disposing of evidence after the fact. The torn veil Archie recovered. That was Eleanor's signal to you to meet her that night, the night she herself disappeared for good. You silenced her first." Claire's hand flew to her mouth. Henry just stared. Kramer let out a low whistle. Wolfe raised a hand to silence them all. "And you made a single mistake," he said, his eyes boring into Matthew. "A verbal mistake, which gave you away." Matthew blinked. Wolfe leaned back, satisfied. "When Archie returned from his first visit to the cemetery, he told me the groundskeeper had said, 'Plenty of ghosts in this place. Some of 'em don't stay where they're put,' a poetic notion, but hardly something a stranger would say without context. Yet when you arrived tonight, you used the same phrasing when Archie mentioned the cemetery. You couldn't resist. Because you buried Eleanor there once, and you buried her again properly when she became inconvenient." Matthew's cane slipped from his hand, and that, ladies and gentlemen, was checkmate. If I had $1 for every time Inspector Kramer arrested the wrong person and then barked at Wolfe for pointing it out, I'd be rich enough to hire my own orchids. So it didn't surprise me one bit when, after Wolfe finished laying out the case against Uncle Matthew like a tapestry, Kramer shoved his hat back on his head and barked, "You're reaching, Wolfe. You always do." Wolfe didn't flinch. "On the contrary, Inspector, you always arrest too soon." Kramer's cheeks colored like he'd swallowed a cherry tomato. "I've already got Henry booked and waiting at the precinct," he shot back. "We caught him at the cemetery with dirt under his nails and a bloody rock in his pocket. And now, you're telling me he's just a poor, innocent boy?" "Yes," Wolfe replied simply. Henry blinked, and Claire made a noise halfway between a sob and a scoff. Kramer jabbed a finger in Henry's direction. "We've got motive and means right. Here, family fights over money, a cemetery rendezvous, he goes nuts and smashes a head in. Done." Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him is the equivalent of a shout. "Inspector," he said coldly, "do you believe a nervous boy with no record of violence, who could not muster the courage to meet my gaze last night, would plan not 1, not 2, but 3 killings, including that of his own aunt, and then linger at the scene of his crime to be caught? Phewy, preposterous." Kramer opened his mouth, shut it, and then opened it again like a fish trying to form an argument. "The evidence is misleading," Wolfe cut in, "as it always is when you refuse to look past appearances. Henry was digging in the cemetery because Eleanor, alive, had lured him there under the pretense of confessing her role in the family scandal. When he arrived, she was already dead. Matthew killed her beforehand and left her body where Henry would find it, along with a conveniently bloody rock. Young Henry panicked, as you would expect, and you arrested him before he could even stammer out the truth." Kramer's jaw tightened. "And," Wolfe added with the faintest smile, "you will release him before the night is over. You may save face by announcing that further investigation uncovered Matthew's guilt. I am unconcerned with how you phrase it, so long as you stop wasting everyone's time." Kramer stood there a moment, clutching his hat, then spun toward the door and barked at the officers outside. "Take him," he said, jabbing a thumb at Matthew. 2 uniform stepped forward and flanked Matthew, who finally slumped in his chair like the fight had drained out of him. "You're making a mistake," Matthew muttered. "No," Wolfe said, his voice sharp as a knife. You made the mistake. The cemetery merely kept your secrets until I arrived to dig them up. Kramer threw Wolfe one last look, half admiration, half exasperation, then stalked out after his men. The room was quiet except for the faint clink of Wolfe's beer glass as I poured him a fresh one. Another one for the scrapbook, I said. Wolfe grunted. Another example, he corrected, of the futility of haste and the triumph of reason. If you've never seen Nero Wolfe in his element, seated behind his desk, facing a ring of suspects like a judge who already knows the verdict, you've missed one of life's great performances. The DeWitts, what was left of them, sat in varying degrees of shock and defiance. Claire perched on the edge of her chair, spine stiff as a flagpole. Henry hunched in his seat, rubbing his hands together like he wanted to disappear. Uncle Matthew, flanked by two officers now, stared sullenly at the floor. Kramer stood off to the side, arms crossed, still chewing an invisible cigar and trying not to look impressed. And Wolfe was magnificent. He waited until the room quieted completely. Then took a sip of beer, set the glass down with a soft clink, and began. You have all, he said, lied to me in one way or another. Some out of fear, some out of pride, and some, his eyes flicked to Matthew, out of greed. Out of greed. Matthew didn't look up. You staged Eleanor's death years ago, Wolfe continued, to preserve your reputation and to keep her silent about your early financial improprieties. But you never counted on her returning and demanding more than you were willing to pay. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the scrap of torn veil. This, he said, holding it up, was her calling card. The veil she wore to haunt her own family, and to haunt you, Matthew. When you learned she was meeting Victor Ames, you followed him, struck him down before she arrived, and left the scene to appear like a botched tryst. But you overlooked the one thing you couldn't control, the witnesses. Wolfe set the scrap down neatly and leaned back. Stanley? Trent saw you that night, digging in the cemetery after you moved Eleanor's body. He assumed you were burying more blackmail money, but when he confronted you, you silenced him too. And poor Henry, Wolfe waved a hand toward the boy, was lured into the same trap, his panic making him look guilty. A perfect scapegoat. Matthew's lips pressed into a thin line. Wolfe let the silence hang for a beat, then delivered the final thrust. And your undoing, he said softly, was your arrogance. You could not resist echoing Trent's words, ghosts who don't stay put, a phrase you yourself fed him years ago to explain the empty graves. That slip revealed you knew what only Trent and Eleanor would have known, that those ghosts were not just stories, but your victims. Matthew closed his eyes and finally spoke. She wouldn't stop, he muttered. I warned her, I paid her, but she wouldn't stop. That, Wolfe replied, is often the trouble with ghosts. Kramer signaled his men, who stepped forward. To take Matthew away, Claire looked as if she might faint, and Henry slumped back in his chair with a dazed sort of relief. Wolfe stood, which he does only when he's certain the curtain has fallen, and declared, You may all go now. My orchids require my attention. I started ushering them out one by one until only Kramer remained. Wolfe, he grunted, halfway to the door. One of these days I'm going to get ahead of you. Wolfe sank back into his chair and reached for his beer. By all means, Inspector, he murmured. One of these days. Kramer left, and the door shut behind him. If you ever wonder how Nero Wolfe earns those fat fees without ever leaving his chair, you should have been there that night. With everyone seated in his office, family, cops, and a killer who was starting to look smaller by the second. Wolfe put on a show that would have made Broadway blush. He let the silence stretch until even the orchids seemed to be listening. Then he began. Facts, he said, are more faithful than people. People lie. They forget, they misremember. Facts do none of these things. And it is on facts, not suspicion, that my conclusions rest? He leaned back and ticked the facts off on his fingers. Fact, Eleanor DeWitt was presumed dead 20 years ago but was not. Fact, she resurfaced recently, blackmailing her family with threats to expose Matthew's fraud and Claire's complicity. Fact, Victor Ames and Eleanor arranged to meet at the cemetery the night of his death. Fact, Henry DeWitt arrived at the cemetery later, Summoned by Eleanor with this note, he lifted the slip of paper and found only a body and a bloody rock. Wolfe let his gaze sweep the room like a lighthouse beam before zeroing in on Uncle Matthew, the only person. He continued, with both motive and opportunity to silence Eleanor and to frame Henry was Matthew. Only you knew where Eleanor was hiding. Only you had fed Trent that line about ghosts long ago, a line you carelessly repeated tonight, and only you, Wolfe's voice dropped to a knife's edge, could have taken the risk of burying Eleanor twice and still believed yourself clever enough to evade discovery. Matthew's shoulders sagged. The fight in him was gone. You made one mistake, Wolfe said. You underestimated the loyalty of facts and overestimated the loyalty of ghosts. Matthew muttered something under his breath, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Kramer finally stepped forward and barked at his men to take Matthew out. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes and folded his hands across his stomach. The case, he murmured, is concluded. Even Claire, who had kept herself together up to this point, let out a faint sob. I showed them all out, leaving just Wolfe, me, and the faint scent of orchids. I stood by his desk, hands in my pockets, watching him savor his quiet victory. You really do love these finales, I said. Of course, Wolfe replied, not opening his eyes. They are the only justifiable inconvenience. By the time the last of them cleared out, Kramer growling like a bear on his way down the steps, Claire holding herself together by what looked like sheer spite, and Henry looking like he'd just aged 5 years in a single evening, the brownstone was quiet again. Wolfe sat at his desk, studying the torn scrap of black veil one last time before setting it down with a faint look of distaste. As if it were just another dead leaf in his orchid room, he rang for Fritz, who appeared almost instantly with a tray of beer. And for the first time that evening, Wolfe allowed himself the hint of a smile. You seem pleased, I said, leaning against the doorframe. I am, Wolfe admitted. Justice was served, and I was not obliged to leave this chair to see it. Done, I grinned. That's what we call a perfect night at the office. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Perfect? Phewie, it is never perfect. There is no perfection in murder, but there is satisfaction in resolution. I watched him for a moment. As he sipped his beer, the way his shoulders sank back into their familiar, immovable slope. Outside, the rain finally started to fall. That was quite a fiction you dismantled. I said, fictions, he corrected. Plural, the fiction of Eleanor's death, the fiction of Henry's guilt, the fiction of a family that believed it, could bury its secrets as easily as its dead. Fictions are brittle, Archie. The facts remain. Fritz returned to clear the tray, and Wolfe finally pushed back his chair, rising slowly, and only then did he finally head for the plant room's dot. As he disappeared among the orchids, he said over his shoulder, Archie, lock the door behind you. Tomorrow we have business to discuss. Tonight belongs to the orchids. I couldn't help but chuckle, Dot, so I sat there for a moment longer. Just me and the faint smell of flowers, watching the rain blur the city outside the window. Dot, say what you will about ghosts. Some of them really do stay where you put them, once Wolfe gets through with them, Dob. And as for the rest of us, well, we keep the lights on, pour the beer, and wait for the next knock at the door.